Hello, students of European history, and thanks for tuning in to today's lecture on the Russian Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union. Something that happens that is extremely important for 20th century history and makes a heck of a lot of sense from things that we've seen coming from the past. For example, the Industrial Revolution and Marxism. This is supposed to be Marx's dream come true, but as you'll see, it really isn't. This is also indicative of Russian weakness, I think. We'll talk a little bit about that going forward here. In 1914, Russia goes to war against Austria-Hungary, supporting their Serbian ally or Serbian little friend. You might go back to 1904, 1905, when Russia showed its great weakness in losing the Russo-Japanese War to the Japanese. That also created or caused a constitutional monarchy that the Tsar didn't particularly like. There were, going back many, many years as well, a number of internal divisions because the Russian system was so very conservative, because they didn't let the steam out of the political or social system. There were violent radicals, people who wanted to kill the Tsar or kill his ministers, and spent a lot of time trying to assassinate and murder various officials, while the Russian autocracy and the Russian state tried to crush those people. In 1914, Russia really had to prove itself to be a great power. Remember, this is a period of time when survival of the fittest nation, national Darwinism, is something that is happening. And they had stabbed their Serbian friends in the back a couple of times in the previous 10 or 20 years, not backing them in diplomatic spats with the Austro-Hungarians, as the Austro-Hungarians put pressure on the Serbs for their own political reasons. And so there is a fear that if the Russians do not support the Serbians this time in 1914, that the people of Russia will have a revolution because they don't trust the Tsar, or they don't trust the competency of the Tsar. As I said, there was a constitutional monarchy finally in the late or the early 20th century, created out of this revolution of 1904, 1905. It is a very conservative constitutional monarchy. The Tsar has all of the power, and the people who sit in the Duma or the parliament are really rather powerless. Because of that, too, there were a group of workers that had formed a kind of outside of the ordinary political system of organization called Soviets or worker councils. Imagine that this is more than organized labor and somewhat short of a political party in a way. It's kind of something that is Marxist in a way, not participating in the bourgeois political system, but organized labor in order to be ready, I suppose, at some point in time to replace the regular bourgeois or conservative government that existed in Russia. Around this period of time, too, in the early 20th century, finally trying to catch up to other countries too. Trade unions were increasing in size, they were increasing in power as Russia slowly industrialized and became and had a larger number of proletarians in their population. Well, the war breaks out. The Russians mobilize to support their Serbian friends. They mobilize before the Germans, before the Austro-Hungarians, and so on. And they really had a difficult time mobilizing. They are less industrialized. They are less able to put people on trains, and they certainly don't have a lot of vehicles like automobiles and trucks and so on. And so they just have a really hard time forcing their society, forcing the home front, in fact, to create what it needed to support the war. In general, too, the Russians had, for many, many years, and will continue to do so, rely on large number of soldiers rather than superior technology to win battles and to win wars. And when they did this, they, of course, drafted a lot of young men out of the countryside. They drafted a lot of beasts or animals out of the countryside to pull things rather than having technology to convey things on the battlefield or to the battlefield. Agricultural production fell precipitously, and there were shortages of food really from the beginning of the war, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Russia has a lot of space and a lot of space for growing things. In fact, different points in time, Russia had been kind of a breadbasket for parts of Europe. But shortages existed. Women had to go to work in the fields, had to go to work in factories, and they were really quite burdened by the long hours, in either of those places. They were burdened by the food shortages, and they were burdened, of course, by maimed and dying men. If you rely on numbers in order to win your wars, you're going to have more casualties than the other side. And so, the Russians were particularly burdened by that as well. Millions of men are lost on the battlefield, killed, captured, and as I said, injured or maimed. The Russian military itself, from the very top, at first it is a relative um, uh, of the Tsar, of Nicholas II, who is in charge of the military. Later, the Tsar takes over the military himself. Neither one of these people are very good, and nor are the other generals and officers so much in the Russian army, all the way from the top down. Their equipment is not quite as good as what others had, and their morale suffers really from the very beginning battles that they lose, and then they continue to lose battle after battle after battle. And it's kind of like a sports team, maybe, that you've ever been on, a bad sports team where before the season you thought that you had a chance. You realize after a few games that you don't, and then you're never really going to get back into thinking that you're going to win games and turn the war around, so to speak. This is what the Russians are having pretty much the whole war as well. The royal family itself seemed to be nice people. They seem to be rather out of touch, though, with the common Russians. They are viewed as gods in many ways by a lot of simple peasants, and they live a kind of life that is hard to imagine. They basically own, this continent. They own a nation of 12 time zones. It's hard to believe. They're extremely wealthy. The Tsar loves his family. He loves his wife. It's a little bit different, perhaps, than what you find in going through history with royal families. They have a love affair that is between a Russian man, the Tsar, and a German woman. The Tsarina is a German woman. And at this point in time in the 20th century, in the late 19th century, your ethnicity, your nationality is starting to matter. Just like it matters for the Austro-Hungarians, the Habsburgs are Germans, and they are ruling over a lot of non-Germans. Well, here is a German woman. They're going to war against Germany, and it's thought that maybe she's some sort of German spy, or that she isn't completely loyal to the Russian state. Of course, all of that is nonsense. She has adopted Russia as her country, and her family is Russian, and she wants them to be successful. But they have a problem, and that problem is the young boy that you see there in the photograph. Alexei has hemophilia. It's a blood disease that is genetically inherited. He's not going to live very long, and he has kind of a sickly life. The person who seems to be able to help him through miraculous works is this guy by the name of Rasputin. You can see the cartoon there. He's really kind of a creepy, sort of religious, quasi-religious figure or monk who meets the royal family and seems to be able to help their son through his bouts of painful hemophilia. Rasputin, although is also a very shady character that everybody knows for chasing women and being really kind of corrupt, and people don't know about the weakness of the Tsar's family. They don't know about the hemophilia. They keep that secret for a long period of time, and so people wonder why the royal family is hanging out with this Rasputin character, and it damages them and their credibility and respectability with a lot of Russians. In March of 1917, after years of losing the war and losing hundreds of thousands of men, the straw breaks the camel's back, so to speak. Women in the capital of Petrograd, St. Petersburg renamed with a less German-sounding name, were demonstrating against the war, against the long hours, against being burdened by hunger and all that kind of stuff. And usually when a demonstration was out on the streets, then you had Cossacks, these kind of almost like Russian cowboys or army troops, put down the demonstrations, chase the people off the streets. But at this point in time, the loyalty of the Cossacks, the loyalty of the troops is really quite questionable. Those guys who are in Petrograd at this point in time could be sent to the front. They don't want to be sent to the front. So they don't want to put down a demonstration against the war. This kind of spirals out of control to the point where the government goes to the Tsar and says, we don't trust, the people don't trust you, and we don't trust that we can keep you safe from the army or from the people. You need to abdicate, which he ends up doing. And wow, we have a Russian republic in March of 1917. A provisional government then, a kind of bourgeois provisional government, exists from March through November of 1917. It has all the kinds of freedoms that you might expect from a liberal state, including for a short period of time the abolition of capital punishment. Well, the people who are running this provisional government think that just by having a non-autocratic state, a more democratic state, a state with liberal kinds of freedoms, that the people are going to rally around it and maybe win the war. They want to continue the war. They don't want to drop their French and British and soon enough American allies and leave them at the mercy of the Germans. And so they continue the war, which is a really bad idea. People were against the war as much as they were against the Tsar. About 2 million men had deserted by the fall of 1917. They're walking off the battlefield with their weapons, going back home. And when they get home to where they're from, they simply seize land at gunpoint away from the nobles who controlled about half the land after serfdom was done away with. Well, those Soviets, those worker councils from before still existed. And those worker councils as a kind of organization outside of the government wanted more socialism than what a provisional government, a liberal bourgeois government was going to get them. They wanted also peace right away. And so they are against the war and they're basically against the government. The Bolsheviks, a radical political group, a revolutionary group, wanted a Marxist revolution and they wanted socialism now. And so the Bolsheviks ally with the Petrograd Soviets. You have a political party allying with a bunch of workers to push a revolution forward. And the slogans of Lenin, this is the head of the Bolsheviks, really show what the Bolsheviks' program is. All power to the Soviets. Have a government run by worker councils. It's very Marxist. Or all land to the peasants. Let the poor people in the countryside have all of the land. Or simply stop the war now. That's nice. That's what they wanted. Or the pithiest and the best, I think, is peace, land, bread. There's Lenin. Well, on November 7th, 1917, there was an October Revolution. The Russian calendar is a little different than ours. It's 10 days behind. The provisional government became increasingly authoritarian as men deserted and people weren't listening to them anymore and so on. It was unpopular both on the left and on the right. And a right-wing coup was attempted by a general at the front. He wanted to bring his troops back to Petrograd and take over Petrograd. So they load up onto trains and they're moving towards Petrograd. The government, fearing General Kornilov and his troops coming, decides to open up the armories and arm workers and soldiers and sailors who were in Petrograd to defend the city from this right-wing coup. Trotsky, another Bolshevik leader, a right-hand man of Lenin then, organizes the workers, soldiers, and sailors to seize power away from the provisional government. And it's really quite surprising how little resistance there was. They topple the government really pretty easily. There's Leon Trotsky. He is the leader of the Red Army, and as I said, Lenin's right-hand man. Well, this Bolshevik or Soviet government was able to get together in a kind of parliament called the Congress of Soviets and simply pass decrees that they really couldn't enforce or had already been done anyway. So they officially, legally, according to them, divided up the yet unclaimed landlord land. So the promise of land is, being being given to the people. And then the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they signed it with the Germans in March of 1918. It's a humiliating peace for the Russians, but it brings peace legally, at least in the eyes of the left-leaning Congress of Soviets. Out of this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, however, Russia is really losing its most valuable parts, the Ukraine, Baltic states, and Finland. Now, Lenin says these losses are unimportant because a worldwide revolution is coming soon, and this is going to be a worthless piece of bourgeois paper. There you can see Finland and the Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and bits and pieces of Poland and Ukraine that they were simply giving up to the Germans. The Germans are very excited. They're going to pull 1 million troops off the Eastern Front, and then they hope to use all of this area as a kind of breadbasket for themselves. They had been starving since 1916, 1917. Well, speaking of bread, it's really difficult for the Congress of Soviets to actually get bread in people's mouths. It's easy to say you can divide the land. It's easy to say that they're going to surrender to the Germans, but how do you actually get bread into people's hands, especially with the disruptions of the beginning of a civil war between the left-leaners and the right-leaners in Russia at this point in time, especially because both sides of the Civil War have armed forces that are requisitioning or taking bread, taking flour, taking agricultural produce from the people. Starvation and disease increased rapidly in the situation and are going to last for years. That Russian Civil War is really kind of a tragedy because after World War I, 3 or 4 years of just horrible losses, there are another 3 or 4 years of horrible losses in the Civil War, where you have the Bolsheviks and the Soviets, the Reds, versus everybody else, really, the Whites. The Whites are landlords and army officers and churchmen and the bourgeoisie. They each have a very specific reason why they are opposing the Reds. And you can think about, what each one of those would represent and why they would hate the Reds. And the whites are being supplied by the Allies, who, as of 1918, the end of 1918, win World War I, and then are able to provide a lot of war material to these whites because they fear communism. They want to defeat communism at any price. But it isn't enough of an intervention with troops or anything like that to actually win the Civil War for the whites. And it's a very brutal Civil War. Millions of people are dying. It's a very personal kind of conflict. You can see all the different kinds of whites on the outskirts of the center of this part of Russia, and this center part then is controlled by the Bolsheviks. And this is one of the reasons why the Bolsheviks are able to win. They hold the center and they're able to fight off these various white armies as they encroach upon Bolshevik territory. It's not a spit and polish kind of conflict. It's really, a bunch of people who are being conscripted and thrown together with whatever weapons and uniforms they have, and then, just a lot of horrible stuff is going on. People are starving, as you can see in the top right. There are prisoners who are kind of bound and then murdered. A lot of atrocities are committed by the whites against the reds and the reds against the whites. And it's just really kind of a chaotic slaughter on both sides. Well, there is something called war communism and the terror or terror that happens during the Civil War, which also is a reason why the Reds are able to win. And think about this: for war communism, they wanted to seize the Bolsheviks, the Reds wanted to seize what they needed to win the war. So they nationalize industry. They take it away from capitalists and put it in the hands of their government. They want food to feed their troops and to bring to the cities to feed the workers of the city. And so they requisition food once again. Peasants don't like this. Once again, some of them starve. Forced labor of people in the countryside and in the cities as well is something that they do. They conscript men into the Red Army. They may not be super happy to fight, but if the other thing is simply being executed for not fighting, people do that. There's a Russian secret police force called the Cheka. Eventually, it'll be called the KGB. They are executing class enemies and whites of all kinds. They're torturing people. It's kind of a remove the Enlightenment, go away from the Enlightenment. Who cares about the Enlightenment anymore? The 20th century seems to be, forgetting its more noble past and getting back into almost like medieval times. Concentration camps are set up, huge camps where people are just sort of abused to death. Famine breaks out, not just because it happens, but almost as a political policy to destroy areas that are supporting one side or the other. And this really does work. The terror involved in war communism and the terror silences the opposition. People fight with, alongside the people of the Red Army. They refuse to get out on the streets and demonstrate. They're scared to death. So the Soviet Union that is created then out of this civil war and the loss of World War I really shows us the capability or the potentiality of Russian power in a completely new totalitarian state. It is a complete social power shift where people who wield hammers and sickles are now at the top of society, and the old bourgeois people and the aristocrats, the wealthy, are at the bottom of society now. But this is not Marxism realized. The state never withers away. There is a new exploiter class called the Communist Party, and it's totalitarian, a totalitarian state. They completely control their people. There is a dictatorship of the proletariat that never stops, and they're able to control the hearts, the minds, the thoughts of people as well through totalitarianism. This totalitarian state is going to radically affect 20th century history. Its very existence creates the antithesis of a so-called Marxist state and creates right-wing fascist states. This is going to frighten capitalist nations as well. Places like Britain, France, the United States that are liberal democracies are going to be frightened by a Red Scare, but many places are going to be scared beyond that into, like I said, a super hyper nationalistic right-wing regime. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you took some good notes from it. Thanks so much. If you have any questions, let me know.